Okay, welcome back from your second spring break. Kind of what it seems like, doesn't it? Especially if you don't have Monday classes, because then you get even that much more time off. So just remember that next year, right? Take Monday, because this happens every year. You have something due this week, right? Your progress reports due end of the week, right? Um, so hopefully you've had enough time to make some progress. Remember that I'll be looking for the fact that you've gotten some stuff done, and I'll be using it as the opportunity to sort of tell you what you really need to be looking at that you haven't looked at yet, and that you should be spending time with not only, how does this work help me in my research, but remember that you need to get some information on the author as well to establish why they're credible as a source. We went over all of this last week before the break, right? Someone asked me by email a very good question. What do I do if I have a work with 5 authors? Do I need to give you information on all 5 authors? And my answer to the person was no, the lead author will be good, right? That's really all you need. If you find stuff on the other ones, you wouldn't be graded down for including it, right? But you don't really need to beat yourself up if you've chosen a book, found a book, and it's very helpful, and it happens to be by 4 authors, right? You don't need something on everybody. But the library is usually pretty good about uh, listing the entry by the most prominent, the lead author on the project, right? Because usually with those, there's one person who's kind of running the show, right? So again, be sure you spend time before you turn it in, that you look at the assignment, read it carefully, look at the sample that's there, make sure yours looks like the sample. That's the whole point that, why I went through the trouble to put that there, was to give you something to look at. Yeah. If you're having trouble finding anything, if you have any questions, the sooner you can set up an appointment to come and meet me and talk, the better, right? So that's that. The other thing is, a few of you haven't picked up your midterms yet, so if you want to get those back from me, it's up to you to come and find me, okay? The other thing is that over the break, a little bit later than I wanted to, but I put up some makeup lectures to sort of make up not only for the class that we had to miss before, right, when I wasn't well, but also the fact that I'm not going to be in class next Monday, right? I'm going to be at a conference. So that class will be canceled, right? So in order to make up for this lost time and not to sort of keep us mired in the 17th century for the rest of class, I put some lectures up online, and they're under the classes page. The PowerPoints are there as well, just as they are when we have class. And I think if you total up all the time, it's about an hour and 45 or 2, but that makes up for like 3 lost classes, right? So it's still faster than it would have been otherwise. And it's broken up into sort of 5 different sections. And it covers the Baroque period, which is the 17th century, picking up sort of where we left off with Bernini, right? And then going through the different countries. What is Baroque like in Spain? What is it like in Flanders? What is it like in Holland? And finally, what is it like in France? And that's kind of where we're going to pick up now, is with that idea. And with that online lecture, what we saw when we looked at Baroque art in France was a sort of unique beast, in that Baroque in all of the other countries was very, very dramatic, very, very stimulating, attempted to engage you as a viewer in a number of different ways, either through drama and pathos or through appealing to your senses, right? But when we got to France, it's just really different. Baroque art, if we think about Baroque, is not meaning a style, but meaning a period, right? 17th century. Then Baroque art in France is really staid. It's really dry. There's not a lot of movement. There's not a lot of action. It's what we call classical, right? Classicism. It's really posed and frozen, right? You don't get Caravaggio dramatic lighting. You don't get people flailing about. And the reason for this, we think as historians, is that Baroque art in France was reacting against Mannerism. because Mannerist art really took hold in France because it was sponsored by the king in the 16th century, right? Francis I and his successors. And as we move into the 17th century, particularly around the third decade of the 17th century, we have new leadership in France, new kings, particularly Louis XIV. And they seem to champion a style that is different from the forefathers, right? Something new for a new time. And Louis XIV sponsors classicism, particularly through the French Royal Academy, which we're going to talk about a lot, because it's a really important force in the development of art, particularly in France, but that sort of spreads from there elsewhere. The French Royal Academy, which was founded in 1648 by King Louis XIV. And the whole point of the Royal Academy was to train artists that he could draw upon to decorate like the palace at Versailles, other royal residences, make gifts for diplomats. And he wanted these to all be the same style because he wanted the work of art to reflect the king, not the artist, right? So if we get a fairly dry classical style, then it represents something entirely different. And this sort of, from that point, from the king, sort of petered out everywhere, sort of spread from there. So Claude Lorrain isn't necessarily working for the king here, but he is working for French patrons who want things that resemble what the king has. That gives it status. That gives it value. And Lorrain lives most of his life in Rome, working for French expatriates living there. And here the Judgment of Paris, where the shepherd Paris is called upon to judge between three Greek goddesses as to who's the most wonderful, right, is a classical theme, but also rendered in this very sort of stagey, posed, non-dramatic style, right? So we see sort of ricocheting in French art from one extreme, mannerism, flailing and confusing and strange anatomies, lumps of flesh, right? To classicism, much more dry, straightforward, non-dramatic. And then when we move into the 18th century, we sort of ricochet back to a much more flamboyant style, beginning around 1710, 1715, that historians now call Rococo, which is where French art kind of gets more Baroque than it was in the Baroque period, right? Much more flamboyant. And again, it's a reaction against the classicism of the 17th century. So this is a pendulum swing, if you will, where artists of a generation will be reacting against what artists of a previous generation had done in the attempt to try to do something new. And what happens in that attempt to do something new is one discovers that nothing's really new. What's new is what's really old, right? How do you break with what your dad did? Well, you turn back to what your granddad did, right? And that's what we see artists at this period, and particularly in France, doing, is sort of swinging back and forth between these poles of flamboyance on the one hand and classicism on the other, right? So the Rococo period is significantly less classical. Some things, the sense of atmosphere is still there. But in addition to moving away from this rather staid image of classical antiquity, we have a contemporary image of a woman on a swing, so there's a little bit more action there. But it's also aristocrats at play. And that's again because this pendulum swing is not just artists reacting against their dad, right? That's not all it is, although that's part of it. Another element is what's going on around the works of art. Who's sponsoring them and for what purpose, right? So the classicism of the 17th century was sponsored primarily as a style by King Louis XIV. And other artists, trickle-down theory, right? The old Reagan trickle-down theory of economics, start up here and everything will end up down there, kind of works with art, right? It starts at the top and it trickles down. With 18th century French art, the reason for the new style has to do again with patronage. The aristocrats who had lived near Louis XIV, when he moved the capital of France to a country villa in Versailles. You've heard of the town of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, right? He moved to Versailles, made that the royal palace. When he dies in 1715, his son, Louis XV, moves the royal palace back to Paris, back to the Louvre. Right? This is what the Louvre was before it was a museum, the French royal palace in Paris. And when he moves back, so do the aristocrats, right? The extended group around the court who are thriving because of the favor they get from the king. And they establish new chateaus in and around the periphery of Paris, and they need new works of art to decorate them. They are the movers behind the Rococo style, right? These new urban villas, if you will, right? New urban palaces for the aristocrats are being decorated with scenes of the countryside. And these scenes illustrate the ideal life they want to lead. And arguably, if you think about 18th century French history, this is the idle rich, right? This is exactly what the French Revolution was fought against. Right? So we see aristocrats in their perfected world doing what they do, which is to say, a whole lot of no work. Yeah? They don't have to. They're born to it, right? They don't, their income comes from people who work their lives for them, right? So the Rococo style, the most, representative examples of the Rococo style are these aristocrats goofing off. Usually amorous, there's usually an erotic overtone to it, in these sumptuous landscapes. And these were meant to decorate their palaces, right? Decorate their chateaus around Paris. This came directly out of a chateau, right? What's interesting about the Rococo as a period in France, right? Think about the term as a relating, or in the same way that Renaissance is sort of 15th, 16th century, right? Baroque is 17th century. Rococo is 18th century, at least the early part. And when we look at the Rococo period, we find that not every work fits this definition. Right? Not every work in France has that sort of frivolous, eroticized leisure, right? With these over-the-top pastel colors. I always liken the Rococo, at least this kind of example, as to, like wedding cake decorations or wedding decorations. Everything is just sort of nice and happy colors, and every, fat children and whatnot, right? But there was also a taste by the same patrons who were buying this for scenes of simple domestic activity. Because remember that works of art, unlike Holland, where everybody's got money, right? And the society is not as class divided from birth as France was, right? In Holland, you made your money. You made your station in life. And so you had everybody buying pictures. But in France, it's not entirely the same. And the same people who are buying these images of themselves goofing off are buying other images of their servants diligently at work. Which kind of makes sense. This is what they want to see, right? They don't want to see their maids and their nurses playing. That's not what they pay them for, right? They want to see them hard at work, right? So the same taste that enjoys The Swing by Fragonard would also enjoy This Attentive Nurse by Chardin, because they both reflect the class base, right? In America, we don't talk enough about class, right? But that sense of that upper class aristocratic station of the people who are buying the pictures, right? The other thing that we need to talk about a bit, and I think I did in the online lecture for this, is the Enlightenment, right? The 18th century, in addition to being the period when these aristocrats moved back from Versailles and repopulated the areas around Paris with Louis XV on the throne, At the same time that that's happening, of course, the Enlightenment is taking root. This is a period of philosophical revival in France. And there were a series of philosophers who called themselves the philosophes, right? A particular school of French philosophy. And Voltaire is one of the most prominent ones of these, one you've probably heard of before. We have a couple of busts of Voltaire in the National Gallery. This one he's got his wig on. The other one we have, he's not wearing his wig. Bald as a cue ball, right? But he's presenting a new sort of interest in philosophy. And what sets the philosophe apart from earlier schools of philosophy is that they are very much interested in human knowledge, everybody is, but they want human knowledge to benefit society, right? So your knowledge is not knowledge for your own sake. Your knowledge for your own sake makes you a better citizen. And that's something I think that we still believe in today. The whole point of being here, right? You may think I'm here because I'm going to get a better paying job. If you're lucky. That works out, right? But ideally, what we who teach you, especially in classes in the humanities like this one, what we hope is that this learning opens your horizons, makes you a better person, allows you to become a more functional, tolerant, right, active member of your society, of your culture. Not to sit back and see what I can take away from it without giving something back. That's what we're hoping, that it makes us better citizens. And these ideas really first came out in the 18th century with people like Voltaire, right? The other great philosopher, I think I mentioned him online, is Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is behind, on a certain level, images like this attentive nurse on your right, because Rousseau also believed that there were certain structures in society, in particular how we raised children, that needed some revision. And we'll come back to that later today, right? The philosophe. So as we talk about the shifts in French art, we have to come back to these external forces. And the philosophe end up playing a huge role in actually the shift away from Rococo towards something a little bit more sedate, right? So this pendulum we've seen going to go back and forth, mannerism to classicism, classicism to flamboyant Rococo, it's going to swing again, right? And the artists of the end of the 18th century will start to react against the frivolousness, the flamboyance of the Rococo, right? So, one of the things that Rousseau recommended very strongly, and I think we still believe this to be really true, is that we should study history, and not all of history, but very particular moments in history, to discover how people have been good citizens in the past. Right? Look for examples of virtuous behavior by studying history. And the point is that by studying history, we always say this is old adage. Those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. You've heard this before, right? And that's kind of an outcome of what Voltaire had been saying in the 18th century. And he's writing already by about 1720, right? And Voltaire says we need to study history because history provides us lessons and we can apply to our lives today, right? And that can make us better citizens. He can give us examples of proper behavior, of attitudes, of character traits that we should try to adopt, right? And the term he used for this, of course, is in Latin, but examples of virtue. It's not hard to, you don't need to know Latin 101 to figure out that exemplum virtutis is an example of virtue. And that's what he called these great moments in history, these great events that we could study, is they provided us with moral examples of virtue, right? And because he's interested in rationality, right? Rational thought. He's not very much interested in the Middle Ages. Right? He's really interested in the Renaissance. And he's really interested in classical Greece and Rome, periods where logic was the dominant trait, rationality was the dominant trait. So when we think about what Voltaire is saying about virtue, history presenting us a series of examples of virtue, we find when we look at painters in the last quarter or so of the 18th century, we find a whole group of them that are also giving us pictures from history that are presented as examples of virtue. So Jacques-Louis David is by far the best example in France of this new style. So again, the pendulum's swinging back, right? Away from frivolity, away from silliness. Aristocrats playing love games, blindfold and swinging around and whatnot. The pendulum is now swinging back to a more classical theme, right? So again, that back and forth that we've been seeing. We refer to this as neoclassicism, right? The successor to the Rococo. Because classicism had already been there under Poussin. Classicism had already been there under the Italian Renaissance. But this is new, new classicism, right? So the neoclassical movement supplants, replaces Rococo toward the end of the 18th century, 1770s onward, even though things don't change totally overnight, right? There'll still be some times when the two overlap. And in fact, our picture here is less than 10 years later than the Fragonard swing picture that we saw, right? Now, what's our story here? Jacques-Louis David gives us a scene from Roman history. And it's in fact very, very early Roman history, before the emperors. This is at the very dawn of Roman history, like 7th century BC, when Rome is fighting for its original independence and identity, trying to free itself from a series of tyrannical kings in this earliest age, right? And they're going to turn from that to a republican government where their leaders will be elected, right? So there's this period of early Roman history when they've given off early tyrannical kings, and it's before the emperors, okay? And that's what this scene comes from. The oath of the Horati. Double I in Latin is the plural of ius. So this is the oath of the sons of Horatius, the Horati, okay? And so here are the Horati, the three sons. This is Horatius, their father, right? And they are fighting against a rival tribe in early Rome. The rival tribe, interestingly, also has three sons. Like this kind of parallelism, right? And they're fighting on the side of freedom and liberty and representative government. But they have to wipe out this other group that's fighting to preserve the power of the totalitarian king, right? The sons of Kyriatis, the Kyriati, right? So this is the moment when the three sons of Horatius are swearing to take up arms and fight until death for what they believe in, right? And you look at David has really staged this nicely, really clear, really straightforward. Three sons, their arms sort of right next to each other. The three swords kind of mirroring the three arms, aren't they? Just off 90 degrees. And in fact, to make it clear, to make that connection, he has Horatius, the father, hold those swords in a way that loses fingers, right? I mean, he's not holding the swords by the grips, he's holding them by the freaking blades, right? That's a good way to lose all your knuckles. And that doesn't matter because, art trumps reality on a certain level. And he's offering them up to the gods, right? And the sons are swearing and in lockstep. And there are three arches behind them, like there are three sons. Everything's kind of nicely knit together, right? And very much thought through. This is a hallmark of classicism, right? It's that kind of lack of spontaneity, right? On the right is mom with two daughters. So Mrs. Horatius and his two daughters. And it turns out that one of the daughters, the one in blue, right? And here I got a detail of that. The one in blue is secretly engaged to one of the enemy sons. The brothers don't know about it. So at this moment in the story, the woman on the right is going to either lose her brothers or her lover, right? And she's sort of stuck in this. And what it's the story plays out, right? It's actually a really cool story. So they're out there fighting the three against the three. The army's on the sides and people cheering them on. And I don't know which of the three brothers, but one of the three brothers of the Horatius, two of them are killed. There's one left, right? And the three Curiatus brothers are there, and they're still alive. But he's fighting, and they get wounded, right? And they're all sort of like, and so what he does, he turns and runs away, knowing that they'll chase him, right? But the problem is that they're wounded, so eventually as they're chasing them together, then they're apart, right? And then he also turns on us and kills the first one because they're so far apart. He kills the second one, and he says, "That's for my two brothers, and this is for freedom." And he gets the third one, right? And so she loses her lover, and then he goes back home, and this is where Roman history does this sort of stuff, right? He goes back home, and she's like, "Oh, you killed my lover," and he lets it go. He goes, "No woman should ever root for anybody else other than the family that kills her too." Right? So, the point of the story, right? What's the example for Tutus here? Sometimes there are causes that are more important than family. I don't know if I buy into that, right? But it's sort of, you have to be Don Corleone with The Godfather, right? Never ever vote against the family, right? But sometimes there are causes that you even don't want to preserve yourself for, right? You're willing to fight to the death for a cause. And in this particular case, the fight against tyranny, right, is that cause. So for Voltaire to mine out of this story, which has for modern audiences kind of creepy overtones, right? For Voltaire to mine out of that is this idea that sometimes you've got to put your own concerns aside for something greater. And in this particular case, that something greater is freedom from tyranny. Right? That's the exemplum virtutis here. Now, David, right, submits this to remember we talked about the Salon, online I did, right? King Louis XIV established the French Royal Academy, right? And the Royal Academy's job was to train artists and support artistic endeavor. And so not only was it a place for younger artists to learn, by the way, women weren't allowed, which is part of the reason we have very few women artists from this period, they didn't have the same opportunities. But in addition to training, they also sponsored a biennial show every 2 years, big exhibition called the Salon. Right? So every 2 years there's this massive show. Everybody turns out, like it's huge. It's a massive thing on the social calendar. Everybody goes, right? Hard for us to imagine that. We got TVs and freaking cell phones, right? We don't need to go somewhere to see something. We can get it all piped into us, right? Well, the Salon, everybody turned out to see this, and at the Salon, everything was for sale as well. Hey, speaking of the Salon, the student show opens on Friday. Go, right? Friday from 6 till 8. Annual student show, fine arts, graphic design, fashion design, all have works that are being juried into the show. We're hanging it tomorrow. Free cheese and wine. And non-alcoholic beverages too, for those of you who are underage. But it's your classmates, right? So come on out and see it. Our salon, if you will, right? But they did it every second year, and at the salon there were prizes that were offered as well. Prizes for best newcomer, prizes for best picture, and the king would show them buy stuff. The ministers would buy things as well, right? So it's a big thing. Not only did you get accepted into the salon because it was juried, not everything went in, But over and above that, it was a great opportunity to show off your best new stuff, right? So this was given to the Salon in 1784, right? The date on this is important. This is where studying history becomes important for dates. 1784 in France. We are within 5 years of the French Revolution, right? The French Revolution is 1789, and by the way, we're, what, 8 years after our revolution, the American Revolution. So the idea of a fight against tyranny, right? Giving of yourself for the good of society, right? Willing to sacrifice everything for a greater cause is in 1784 an amazingly poignant thought. Because keeping in mind that they were encouraged to think of this as an example of virtue to apply to your current day situation, that becomes an example of virtue for people priming for a revolution against a king that they see as a tyrant, that they see as out of touch, fighting to the death for the good of the republic. Right? In this case, it's not a republic yet. Right? To drive the point home that that's what this picture is really all about, after the revolution in 1789, they bumped the 2-year cycle. And they had a salon right after the revolution. So the revolution is July, salon was in the fall. And David put this work back into the salon in 1789, right? To show that this was the example and this related directly to what was going on in France today. Right? So neoclassicism is tied up very closely with what's going on in France, not only philosophically, but also politically. Right? The idea of these exemplum virtus, I should have had this up there, French Revolution, 1789. Now, Jacques-Louis David is this fascinating character because of all the painters we looked at so far, he's the one that's most deeply engaged with politics. He was a member of the most radical wing of the French revolutionaries. You know your French, you don't have to worry about this, but the Jacobins, they were the ones that supported the idea of cutting off everybody's head. Right? David was part of that. And he was called upon by the revolutionaries, right, after the revolution, to do a number of things that, for the state. He single-handedly designed and decorated Voltaire's funeral, right? He was called upon to paint a massive picture of the oath that was sworn by the revolutionaries that they would fight until death. It's going to be like 40 feet across. He never finished it, right? He is deeply involved. He's friends with Robespierre, right? He's deeply involved with the revolution. Now, he's not out there himself fighting in it, but he is tight with everyone in the revolution. And he paints this picture as a gift for the revolutionaries. And it was painted in 1793, 4 years after the revolution. A year that's known as the Terror. This was the year of the beheadings. Literally 30,000 people in like a month and a half. This is where they invented the guillotine, so it was so much quicker, right? So much more efficient than having a guy with a hatchet out there, right? Everywhere you go in France, the Place de la République, in every city, is where the guillotines were set up. Contemporary accounts said the rivers ran with blood. Right? And David is friends with these guys. Right? Now, I have nothing against the French Revolution at all. But the idea that every aristocrat had to lose their head. Right? David made a drawing of Marie Antoinette as she is on her way to the gallows. He was there. Right? Now, there was a faction in France that was still pro-monarchy, anti-revolution, counter-revolutionaries. And they struck back. But guerrilla style, right? Here and there. And the picture on your left, with David painted as a gift for the revolutionaries, shows a journalist who was instrumental in helping foment the ideas of the revolution, and even after the revolution, writing about the rights of the common man. That's really what the revolution was all about, the rights of the common man. And Marat was a newspaper man who helped make those ideas popular. Right? Take an idea that might be there with the philosophe and have everybody on the street be talking about it. Now the problem with Marat is that he had eczema, horrible skin eczema everywhere. Just made it uncomfortable. And as such, he spent his days in an ointment bath. Right? And he's assassinated by the enemies of the revolution in order to silence his ideas. And so David got into the crime scene, saw it, right, and paints based on the drawings he made there. He shows us Marat still working despite his ailment, set himself up a nifty little writing table there in the tub, right? A little place for his pen on the side. Dedicated à Marat, David, right? He was friends with Marat. And he's holding a letter by the woman that assassinated him. And she says, basically, I am so sad. Could you please see me? And to sort of saying, I'm, on your side. You would make me happy if you would see me. And she comes in and she stabs. You can see the wound. You can see the bloody knife in the corner. We don't see her, right? We just see this outcome. And we see now Marat dead, bleeding out into his own ointment, right? It's violent, but not in a sort of Baroque way, And yeah, there's some Caravaggio going on here, isn't there? Right? Some Caravaggio light. But it doesn't have that same sort of drama that we find in Baroque art. Now, he gives us all these signs of Marat as a writer. We have inkwell, 2 different pens. I like this theme that the pen is mightier than the sword, that his writings will live on, right? So he puts the quill pen down below, right next to the knife. This painting's in Brussels if you want to see it. It's really pretty terrific. And David's job is to sway your opinion with this, right? He wants you to look at the death of Marat as a martyrdom for a greater cause. Same thing with the oath of the Hierati, right? A martyrdom for the greater cause. And so what he wants you to do as soon as you look at Marat is think of him as an innocent victim, right, of this murder. And so what he has, of course, is just the note, right? And he's helpless in the bath. That much is actually accurate, right? But then, to make him a martyr for a greater cause, what Jacques-Louis David does, and this is important for neoclassical art, is he turns back to images of Jesus. Christ having been lowered from the cross and mourned by his mother Mary. What's called a pietà image, right? And the slung arm, the placement of the body, the other arm on his hip on the other side, are all lifted from and placed into Marat. That makes him the one who died for your benefit. That makes him the martyr, right? And that, looking back to previous art and lifting it directly, previous art from the Renaissance, previous art from ancient Rome and Greece, that's another hallmark of neoclassicism. Right? So, David, deeply wrapped up with the politics of the time, right? Makes paintings that voice sort of proto-revolutionary ideas, then becomes deeply wrapped up with the revolutionaries themselves, immediately following the revolution. He also becomes friends with Napoleon, even before Napoleon becomes emperor. Okay? He actually met him early on, sketched him from life. Napoleon, French history 101, right? Okay, so you got a king. At the time of the revolution, it's Louis XVI, right? It's a grandson of Louis XIV. And the French are revolting. The French are revolting against Louis XVI, right? They don't want monarchy. What they want instead is a representative style government, just like we fought for in 1776, right? That's what they're looking for. They may not follow our democratic example in the elections, but they want something similar: liberty, equality, brotherhood, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. The three parts of, you see it all in the French book. Okay. This lasts for about 10 years. And in 1799, there is a coup against the leaders of the Revolutionary Party, in part sponsored by the drastic measures they had taken to consolidate power. The idea of the beheadings and whatnot brought a backlash against them. Okay? This is simplified. 1799, there's a coup staged in Paris, ousts the government, and instead says, we want Napoleon, who at that point was a general in Italy, conquering regions to be controlled by France. We want Napoleon to be the new leader, the new consul, first consul of France. Right? And Napoleon is shown here crossing the Alps to come back to take that position. Right? Swept by nature. You can see there's a wind at his back, right? It is actually the world, the earth itself has brought him to this power. And even though he crossed the Alps apparently on a donkey, right? Jacques-Louis David does not let any of that get in the way, right? Turns to look at us, horse is rearing up and he couldn't care less, right? He's just sort of like, doesn't really even hold that tight to the reins, right? You think about John Wayne going off into the sunset. He always has to hold on tight when the horse picks up, and he's as easy as he can be in the saddle. Right? But looking toward us, pointing up toward the Alps, leading his troops back. On the rocks in the foreground, he's carved his name, Bonaparte. Other people who've crossed the Alps have carved their names. So there's Hannibal, Charlemagne. Right? He's the next great leader, and he's going to become the first consul of France. Like I said, David knows it. Napoleon commissions this work from David, and about 5 copies of it as well that he gives out as gifts to other heads of state. Being neoclassical, David looks back at a number of older examples of men on horseback and uses them, siphons them, if you will, to become his image of Napoleon. So here from the Parthenon, the famous building in Greece, probably the best example of classical Greek art. We see part of the frieze now in the British Museum, still in Greece in David's time. These figures rearing horseback, and again, sort of easy in the saddle, despite the horse kicking up. And his Napoleon sort of borrowing that motif, right? And what's it meant to do? It's meant to give him the grandeur of ancient Athens, right? Coming to rescue the Republic. Well, be careful what you hope for, I guess, because what happened is after a few years serving as consul, Napoleon has himself crowned as emperor. So it seems a bit ironic, right? The French didn't like having a king. They staged a revolution to get rid of the king, and what do they get instead? An emperor, right? Bigger than a king. Someone who doesn't want to just be king of France, he wants to be ruler of all of Europe, right? I don't know why people still like the guy. I mean, there's Napoleonic societies everywhere. Things like really cool. You don't see Hitler societies out there, And okay, he's not killing Jews in the same way, but at the same time, he had that same sort of idea that he could dominate the entirety of Europe. And I don't get it. So on the left, David paints this huge, it's 20 feet tall. This picture is 20 feet tall, right? Almost 40 feet across. Okay. And it's the moment when Napoleon is being crowned emperor. But what happened, Napoleon decides he's going to become emperor of France. He's going to do it in the way that French kings were crowned in the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, the French king always received his crown from the Pope. And on Nord, the French king would go to Rome, get his crown, come back to France. But if Napoleon did that, then he would be beholden to the Pope, wouldn't he? Right? He got his crown from somebody else. So instead, he summoned the Pope to come to France for the coronation ceremony rather than going down and submit it, right? So the Pope comes up to France, and just at the moment when he's about to put the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon reaches up and grabs it from him, puts it on his own head. And that way he's not crowned by anybody but himself, right? Absolutely no submission to another power. And then he turns around, takes the crown for his wife Josephine, and places it on her head. So what David depicts here in the ceremony in Notre Dame Cathedral is not the moment when Napoleon has crowned himself, but the moment when he's about to crown Josephine. Right? And here's the Pope back here. And Jacques-Louis David is there. Paints himself in the audience because he was there, right? So this is what ended up happening with the aftermath of the French Revolution. That within 15 years, right? 15 years. We've gone from having a king through the first experiment with representative government or republic to having an emperor. Right? And David is right there at every step of the way. We're going through all this because we have a great portrait of Napoleon by David down at the National Gallery, the best portrait of Napoleon in America, right? Painted now a good 8 years into Napoleon's reign as emperor. He's still shown as a military general, right? Leader of the foot soldiers, as a matter of fact. And he's rising from his chair where he's been working. We can see the desk and the chair turning to look at us. He's laid his sword aside, right? And full-length, larger than life-size portrait of Napoleon. Now, as a neoclassical work, you might guess that the pose is going to be based on studying ancient art, right? We've seen this with a lot of neoclassical art. I couldn't find a perfect example, but the basic pose with 1 foot back, 1 foot forward is a take on the contrapposto pose that we talked about in the Renaissance, right? Not really striding forward, but that counterbalance pose. And I just yanked this out of the photos that I have to show us sort of where he gets most of Napoleon's pose, right? So again, it's a neoclassical work, turning back to ancient Roman examples and or Renaissance examples. The details that surround Napoleon are quite important. There is his imperial throne, his initials on the side. You can see the N's down below. The B's were one of the imperial symbols. Lots of legends behind them. We can see behind his elbow on the table there, a folder with the fleur-de-lis, the French royal symbol on it, our Marymount symbol as well, right? And down below it, the code of law, the Napoleonic code of law. This is what he's been working on. Even though he's dressed in military clothing, he has been working on laws that will govern France. And there's these other wonderful clues that he's been working through the night. That he's been doing this instead of sleep. Candles on the candelabra behind his elbow. You can see most of them have burned out and are smoking. But one is just got a little bit of wick left. Right? He's been burning the candle. Right? Staying up late. And you can see pretty clearly that on the wall there's a clock. And the clock says 4:13 or so? Right? Not quite 4:20. On the wall. This is not 4:13 in the afternoon. Right? This is rising at the crack of dawn to meet the soldiers as they get up, also at the crack of dawn, for their original inspection. So again, David is this neoclassical artist drawing on classical references to paint Napoleon, but then adding these details into it that adds a certain more meaning to what we're looking at here. Right? But again, this is that movement that replaces Rococo. Right? One of David's pupils was the painter Ingres, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And David had quite a few pupils. Almost every artist painting in the early part of the 19th century worked with David at one point or another. Ingres submitted one of his paintings to the Salon in 1801, sponsored by the Royal Academy. And the prize that he won was the best prize they gave, which was the Rome Prize, the Prix de Rome. It went to the best work by an up-and-coming artist. Right? I don't know how long you were, available for the prize, right? But nonetheless, Ingres is pretty young when he wins this in 1801. And the Rome Prize, God, it sounds amazing. 2 years, all expenses paid, live in Rome, study art. Right? And the whole point was the best art to see is in Rome. Right? Neoclassicism loves ancient civilizations. Where better to go than Rome? Now, there was a lot of French down there as well. Napoleon had conquered parts of Rome, so that made sense as well. Right? Ingres wins his prize in 1801. 2 years, all expenses paid in Rome. But there were so many French patrons living in Italy that he was able to flip it and stayed there for 20 years, right, working for French patrons. Right? That just became his entry to Rome, was winning the prize. Okay? While he's in Rome, he travels throughout all of Italy. And he becomes deeply interested in a couple of different artists. One of them is Raphael. If we had more time, we'd talk about that as well. The other one is Titian. He becomes enamored with works by Titian. And he does copies of them. He does variations on them. Our picture on the right, Odalise with her slave playing music for her, is based more or less on a Titian composition that exists in 5 or 6 or 7 different variations, where Venus is shown crowned by Cupid, kind of looks like our picture that we saw in half length with the mirror, but laying in her boudoir, making music with a young guy. She's got the pipe, he's got the lute, totally eroticized, by the way. She's holding the pipe. Do I have to explain it? He's stroking that fat-bellied lute, right? And it's pretty straightforward, and he's looking right at her nakedness, right? Ingres has translated this, right, into his work, which is not painted in Titian's style at all. None of the loose brush that you see from Titian. It's neoclassical. It's much tighter in the way that it's painted. And he's translated it out of classical mythology and into a scene from contemporary North Africa. And Odalise is a harem girl, a woman kept as that army of brides, consorts for the emir, the harem. And this is not what it really looked like because nobody else had access to that. It's a fantasy about that. It's a Western European fantasy of what contemporary 19th century Muslim life was like. Okay? What we call Orientalism. Right? This theme that picks and chooses kinds of themes to show us from that culture. And these are not chosen at random, but often chosen very much to paint that culture in a negative light, to show the superiority of Western European culture. So the idea of a hypersexualized woman kept as one of many wives, right, surrounded by opulence, decadence, is meant to show the degree to which European civilization has advanced beyond uh, North African Islamic civilization. And Ang did dozens of these variations on the same theme. The Grand Odalisque is probably his most famous. This is a Lancome ad a few years back, photographed with a real model. But again, little trappings of fantasized Middle Eastern life, a hookah pipe on the right by her feet, that ostrich feather duster, the furs, the jewels, the head scarf, right? It's all not archaeologically accurate, right? It's a fantasy of what this life is like. Here, a bather, also probably intended to be a harem scene of sorts over in the Phillips collection, all drawing on this same theme. And the bodies of the women all very much like Titian's bodies. So within our neoclassicism, we see Ang looking back at Titian, artist from the classical Renaissance period, but then turning what he'd seen into something slightly different, a theme that will run through most of the rest of the 19th century in France. It's important to remember at the time that Ang is coming up with these compositions that France has begun to colonize North Africa, starting with Algeria and moving from there to Morocco by the early part of the 20th century. But they've annexed Algeria already in 1830. And this is part of what feeds this interest in Orientalism. It kind of began with Napoleon. He conquered Egypt for the French. That started to bring this North African interest into France. And then when they colonize Algeria in 1830, that interest becomes cemented. Right? So it's very, very political, this interest in Arab life on the part of Ang and other French painters. Now, neoclassicism was everywhere. We've been looking primarily at France so far, but we find neoclassicism in pretty much every country toward the end of the 18th century and into the early part of the 19th century. We find it in England, a style of painting that looks very much like Jacques-Louis David, very stagey, not a lot of action, very, very classical. And painted by, this is our second women artist. We've had one in one of the online lectures from Holland. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the routes to becoming an artist were not available to women. But Angelica Kaufmann had come from Switzerland, moved to England, and made her career there. And she too gives us an exemplum virtutis, this idea of looking back to the classical past, to history, mining it for lessons that make us better citizens. Now, Cornelia, the woman in the center, is the mother of the sons of Gracchus, the Gracchi. And we see her with her two sons and with her daughter in pink. And her sons will grow up. This is in the 2nd century BC, the story, right? Her sons will grow up to be leaders of Rome. And the image shows us how well they've been raised. What a good job she's done as a mother. Because when they become leaders of Rome, they become leaders of Rome who champion the rights of the common man, an ongoing theme during the Enlightenment, equality of rights. Right? And two of the sons of Gracchus become the champions of that, right? Future leaders of Rome. And the story that she shows us is where Cornelia's neighbor comes to visit. And she's got this kind of snarky neighbor who brings over her jewel box on a visit to Cornelia, right? And she opens it up and she starts to show off her finest jewels. Look what I've got here, you know. And that's exactly what we see her doing, right? Here are my finest jewels. Oh, Cornelia, what do you have? And you can see it's totally nasty, isn't it? It's just very sort of, I'm better than you, right? Here are my jewels. Where are yours? Because she knows that she doesn't have anything even close to match this. Cornelia says, well, here are my jewels. And out come the boys, right? The future leaders of Rome that she has raised so well. And the example of virtuous behavior, of course, is where are your priorities? Going all the way back to Quentin Matsas, we've seen this idea of choosing between earthly possessions and more important things, right? Spiritual values, moral values. And Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, Kaufmann shows us exactly the same thing. Right? This is a far greater gift. These are far greater jewels than anything you've got in your box. It's interesting that the little girl is still in the box. Like her daughter is all over it. I guess it's very, even for a female artist, it's still, that patrimony is. And I also think that the kid on the far left doesn't look like he's quite into it yet. You know what I mean? Like he's still got some loining to do. He still looks like a little bit of an imp, the kind of kid that would go, ooh, what's in that box? Whereas the older one is teaching him. And that's kind of a theme we see a lot in the Enlightenment, is the idea that the mother who teaches children teaches one child well, and that child helps teach the younger ones. And that's exactly what we see going on here with the child in orange helping his younger brother forward and probably going to tell him, no, stuff in the box, not that important. So again, very strong exemplum virtutis. This goes back to what we were talking about before. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this other philosophe, writing during the 18th century, during the Enlightenment. One of the two great philosophical writers in France, right? Voltaire, study history, learn lessons, become a better citizen, right? Rationality. Rousseau, one of the things that he was really championing, Rousseau was the importance of family for developing citizens, good citizens. And he pointed to, this is one of the main things he wrote about, but he pointed to certain practices in society that he felt were getting in the way of producing good citizens. And one of them was using wet nurses instead of direct maternal care. Right? So the idea that the mother of the child would not be the one who would nurse him, but would hire someone else. Do that so the mother of the child could go out and be the frivolous rococo garden player, right? The other thing that Rousseau said was a bit of a problem was the idea of boarding schools, taking children away from their parents, making them live somewhere else to get educated. That if the family unit, Rousseau said, could be held together longer, society would naturally produce better citizens. So if we look at Kaufmann's picture, and keep in mind, even though Rousseau's in France, these ideas are everywhere, right? It really becomes a picture about exactly these Rousseau ideas. The importance of direct contact with your mother to make you a good citizen. No allowance for deaths in the family, right? Certainly not for divorce. Rousseau's other great idea, which will come up later, is this idea of freedom. That man is everywhere in chains, but longs to be free. That's the idea that gave rise to the American Revolution, right? But this is the other side, more social side, about the structures of society and how they can affect the outcomes of what we see around us. Another English artist during the neoclassical period is Benjamin West. He was born in England, spent a lot of his career here in America, went back to England as the war was kicking up. And he depicts for us here a scene from classical antiquity. Again, that seems to be a common theme that we see, where they're choosing scenes from history as moral lessons. This is Helen brought to Paris. Now, if you played back those online makeup lectures, You remember that Paris, we just saw him at the beginning of class, is the shepherd who was asked to judge between three goddesses, each of whom offers him something, and he has to deem which of these gifts is the best, right? Sorry? That's exactly right. And what happens is that Venus offers him the most beautiful woman in the world, and that's what he chooses, right? That's the gift he wants. He could have that, or he could have knowledge, right? And I think he could have power, military power. That's the third one. He wants the girl, right? And Venus then gives him Helen of Troy. Okay? And this is what starts the Trojan War. The face that launched 1,000 ships is Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world. So what we see in West's picture is Paris now, the same guy that we see here, just a little bit more opulently, right? Receiving Helen, who's being brought to him by Cupid and by Venus. This is the result of his judgment, that he does in fact receive the prize. And Venus becomes this disappearing into a cloud. You almost don't notice it. She looks so three-dimensional that her lower body sort of is vanishing as she's about to now bring Helen to Paris. Exemplum virtutis, right? The idea of the past presents us lessons for the present. Helen brought to Paris starts the Trojan War. Painted by Benjamin West, who's grown up in the colonies, has moved back to London, and he's painting this in 1776. You see the analogy here? Helen brought to Paris starts the Trojan War. This is just before the American Revolution. The tensions between England and the colonies are really tight at this point. Right? And people have even pointed to the fact that he has this gathering storms of war in the background and darkness falling across the face of Cupid. So this historical scene is presented to us as an allegory, as a metaphor for what's going on in contemporary politics, in the contemporary world. We can look to the past to see parallels for the present. So again, all of this is part of the neoclassical period. Another artist who grew up in the colonies and ended up moving back to London because they sided with the Brits during the Revolution was Copley, John Singleton Copley. Watson and the Shark. Let's see where I want to go with this. A very large picture, an illustration of a contemporary event. This is a news event of a young guy named Brooke Watson who was swimming in Havana Harbor, Cuba. He was attacked by a shark and lived, but lost a few limbs in the process, right? And we see the moment when Watson's about to be saved, right? This was painted back in London based on his experiences here in America and are, like I said, a relatively recent event. You'll notice a couple of things. First, look at the size of the shark, right? Look at the tail behind the ship, right? Not a particularly accurate shark, but I think we can probably forgive him for not really knowing what sharks look like that well, right? They're not posing for him. Watson, however, the question comes up, what the hell is he doing naked? Why is he hanging out in the Havana Harbor without his clothes on? And we can see as we look at him there that his hair is sweeping off into the beautiful long hair, sweeping off into the waves. He's looking directly into the mouth of that shark. And in the story, the shark came around 3 different times. And he's already been by once, and you can see in the detail on the right that he doesn't have a leg. The leg that's underwater is gone from the knee down. Right? It's not just disappearing, it's gone. He's been eaten already, partially. And he's coming back now for more as they desperately try to save him. So going back to the question, why is he naked? Well, I think on a certain level, part of it is that Copley like a good neoclassical artist, is looking back to ancient art for examples. Really good examples that help him to amplify the theme. So our sculpture on the right, this Hellenistic Greek sculpture. Laocoon was a priest in Troy during the Trojan War. And he tried to warn the Trojans to not take the horse. Right? You know the story about the Trojan horse? Right? So they, now they're 7 years, they can't get through the walls. I know, we'll give them a gift. Right? They all load inside the belly of the horse. Here's the horse. Right? And then they storm out at night. And Laocoon was a priest that said, no. Beware strangers bearing gifts, right? Don't take the horse. That's a bad idea. The problem is that the horse is full of the Greeks, and the gods love the Greeks. The gods are on their side. So Neptune, the god of the seas, sent a bunch of sea serpents to shut up Laocoon, right? To stop him from warning the Trojans that the horse was a problem. Because he wants the Greeks to win. So we see here Laocoon with his two sons being attacked by this amazing serpent that sweeps all the way around them. And if you look at the pose of Laocoon in the middle, and look at Brooke Watson, right? It's the same pose from a different angle. And he's not just choosing classical works of art willy-nilly to use for the basis of this. He's instead choosing works of art that make sense. A figure fighting valiantly against the creatures of the sea, right? Makes sense as a prototype to what you should use if you're going to try to do a contemporary image of a man fighting against the savage powers of the sea. He doesn't stop there. The figure spearing the shark loosely goes back to various images of St. Michael fighting the demon. People often point to this Raphael as good an example as any, where our figure at the top of the helm is about to ram his spear into the back of this watery demon. Okay. Again, that adds to the meaning of the piece. Each of the historical examples he chooses makes the meaning of Watson and the shark that much more strong. This is a demonic beast from nature. And then finally, the overall composition of the figures reaching over to grab Watson out comes direct out of another Raphael. This is a cartoon, a large drawing that Raphael made for a series of tapestries that were woven to hang under the Sistine Sea in the Sistine Chapel. Right? And the drawings floated around everywhere. They're now in London. This is where Christ tells the apostles to throw your nets on the other side and miraculously draw fish. So that's what they've done. And if you look at the poses of these two figures back here and look at the people helping Brooke Watson, you can see, again, Raphael's choosing, Copley's choosing these different examples, each one of which adds a little something to the meaning. Right? Laocoon, the sea serpents, right? St. Michael, the demonic character. In this case, the miraculous rescue. Right? Enhancing the meaning again and again. Okay, I don't want to start this with a minute left. So we'll do a couple of images of George Washington, since these come directly out of the neoclassical period. And we haven't talked about American art yet, much, right? Copley and West worked in America as well. So we'll pick up these and we're going to move on into Romanticism on Thursday, right? If you have, again, remember that you have your progress report for this week. Be sure you read the directions, look at the example there, and if you have any questions about it, don't hesitate to email me, okay? I'll be trying to get caught up on the grading. Your worksheets, right, have been coming in, and I've got most of those, and I've been writing people back when I've got them. So I've got through a ton of those, downloading them today. I'll be getting those back to you soon. All right? Yeah, hey, let me turn this off.